Today we're going to be thinking a little bit more about building sentences, and we'll be focusing on the relative clause. I just want to give you a little word of warning. The relative clause can be challenging to wrap your mind around because there are a lot of rules that have little tiny rules inside of them. So I want you to think of this as an opportunity to stretch your mind to really be able to wrap it around some more specific grammar rules. So, the relative clause. The relative clause adds information about something or someone, so it always comes after a noun. It begins with either the word who, that, or which, and it often interrupts the flow of a sentence, and you'll see what I mean as I give you some examples. So one way that my students and I have been able to remember that a relative clause begins with who, that, or which is to imagine that we see a witch and we ask the question, who's that witch? And in that question we have who, that, and which. Now, which is spelled wrong here, but as long as you remember that the witch you're talking about is spelled like this, I think that you're fine. So, who that witch? I don't actually know, but now I've remembered the three words that begin a relative clause. So here's some examples of relative clauses in action, okay? The house that Jack built is painted pink. The phrase that Jack built is a relative clause. We know that because it begins with the word that, and we also know that it's a relative clause because it adds information about the house. So in other words, a simpler version of my sentence could be, the house is painted pink. But I want to tell you a little bit more about the house, so I add this other information, that Jack built. And I have to stick it directly after the thing that I'm talking about. The house, relative clause, that Jack built, and the relative clause is painted pink. And here you can see how the relative clause interrupts the sentence. The sentence is the house is painted pink. The house is the subject, is painted pink is the predicate, and the relative clause interrupts that by getting in between the subject and the verb. You could write this sentence without a relative clause. You could say Jack built the pink house, or you could say the pink house is built by Jack, and you would have all of the same information, but sometimes it's nice to vary your sentences to kind of pop them up, make them a little spicier, and one way to do that is to use this structure of the relative clause. Here's another example. Jack's house, which is painted pink, there's my which, so I know this is a relative clause, is very large. Again, you can see that the sentence could just be, Jack's house is very large. But I'm choosing to interrupt the sentence by adding a relative clause to add a little bit more information about the word house, which is painted pink. And then I'm getting to the rest of my sentence. So again, my subject is Jack's house, my predicate is very large, and my relative clause is interrupting my subject and predicate to cram in a little bit more information. Again, I can rewrite these sentences without using a relative clause. Jack's pink house is very large, or Jack's large house is painted pink. But when you're writing, you do want to try to vary your sentences. And one way to do it, as I've said, is to add in this relative clause. To me, a relative clause changes the rhythm of the sentence. It's different to say Jack's large house is painted pink, or to say Jack's house, which is painted pink, is very large. So as you're writing, you want to think about the effect that your words have and the rhythm that you're creating with your words. Here's another example. Jack, who, remember that's my other word, who painted his house pink, lives with a rabbit. So again, the basic sentence is Jack lives with a rabbit. Jack is the subject, lives with a rabbit is the predicate. I could rewrite this sentence. Jack lives with a rabbit in a house painted pink. Or I could make it even simpler and say, Jack lives in a pink house with a rabbit. So again, I'm varying my sentences in different ways. Now look at this one. I've taken out Jack, and I'm just calling him the man. The man predicate who lives in, or don't listen to that was wrong. Relative clause. I'm sure you caught me in that one. The man, relative clause, who lives in the pink house, has a rabbit. I can reduce it down. The man has a rabbit. I could rephrase it. The man has a rabbit and they live in the pink house. Or the man and the rabbit live in a pink house. So these are all variations, and one of the variations would include the relative clause. Now, a word of caution. Notice here that I have who, that, which. So I have the three words that make a relative clause, but these sentences are not sentences with relative clauses. These are questions, right? So the words who, that, and, well, who and that, no, who and which, whoo, this is confusing, I warned you. The words who and which have multiple jobs. And another one of their jobs, when they're at the beginning of a sentence, is to create a question. So if I said, write me a relative clause, and you wrote, which rabbit do you prefer? Or, who is that knocking at my door? You would have not written a relative clause. You would have written a question. We also use that as a way of sort of pointing with a word. So if I say, that person is very tall, you would have to imagine that I would be pointing or gesturing towards a particular person when I say that. So again, I have not created a relative clause there. So the way to remember this is that a relative clause will never be at the beginning of a sentence. These words will make questions, or in this case, a sort of pointing gesture. A relative clause will always follow the noun it's talking about. So if I don't have a noun here before the word which, or a noun before the word who, or a noun before the word that, I have not created a relative clause. Unfortunately, there's more. Or maybe fortunately, maybe you think this is really exciting. I don't know. I think relative clauses are pretty cool because, again, they let me pop up my writing. So we have two different kinds of relative clauses. We can have an essential relative clause, or we can have a non-essential relative clause. An essential relative clause, and you can sort of get this from the word, like essential means necessary, right? An essential relative clause adds information that I need to figure out which of the nouns I'm talking about. So if I say the house is painted pink, you might say to me, I don't know which house you're talking about because there's a whole block of houses and for some reason they're all painted pink, right? I would have to add more information about the house for you to know which house I mean. So in other words, this phrase, this relative clause, is essential to narrow down which house I mean. You could also have an essential clause that says, the man, and you would think, Alexine, which man do you mean? And I would say, the man who lives in the pink house. Well, now I'm not talking about any man. I'm talking about the man who lives in the pink house. So this information is essential for me to know which man I'm talking about. The man who lives in the pink house has a rabbit. Okay? So one thing to notice is that essential clauses have no commas. There's no comma on either side of the relative clause. But if I'm dealing with a non-essential relative clause, there will be commas on either side, okay? So in this case, Jack's house. So we know what we're talking about. We're talking about Jack's house. And I'm adding what I think of as bonus track information. It's nice to know, but it's not essential for me to know which house I'm talking about. Jack's house, comma, which is painted pink, comma, is very large. This information is nice, I'm glad to know it, but it is not essential for me to know which house I mean. Or, Jack, okay, I know it's Jack, so I don't need you to tell me anything more, who lives in a pink house, has a rabbit, okay? Jack has a rabbit, I know I'm talking about Jack, but I feel like telling you a little bit more about Jack, so I add who lives in a pink house. You do want to put commas on either side of a non-essential relative clause. And then there's another distinction, that versus which. That and which talk about objects. Who, by the way, talks about a living being, a person, an animal. So when we are writing essential relative clauses, we only use that. The house that Jack built is painted pink. So another way to think about this is you don't need to put commas around a relative clause that begins with that. Jack's house, non-essential relative clause, so we have commas, is painted pink. And in that case, we use which. So which is always non-essential. That is always essential. Who stands alone? Who can be essential or non-essential, and it depends on context. The man, which man? I need that information, therefore no comma. Who lives in the pink house? Has a rabbit. This information is essential. Or Jack, okay, I know enough, but I feel like adding extra information, comma, who lives in the pink house, look at that, I made the mistake again, has a rabbit, non-essential. So that's it for relative clauses. I hope that you could feel your brain stretch and expand to wrap itself around all of these nitpicky little rules. And remember that if you have any questions, bring them to class, and I'll see you soon.